Happy Halloween, my dear Newtopians. Sad that I couldn't be there in the flesh, but at least I had a few moments here to record this reading of my introduction to sex, drugs, and magic. It was an incredibly flattering thing to be asked to write an intro to this book. I'll go into why this was so important to me in the actual piece. But honestly, I kind of wish I'd actually got to say a little bit more in there about, well, sex, drugs, and magic. But you go with what you get in the brief, and this is what I wrote. To be specific, I wrote this on the 23rd of February of this year, which explains a couple of references within, and it's dedicated to the memory of Irving Rappaport. It's called Spiral Architect. And so we return and begin again. Grant Morrison, The Invisibles, first line. Part 1. Strange Loops. It's the year of their Lord, 1971. In San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, Robert Anton Wilson is shopping for some jewellery as a treat for his wife Arlen from a sparse royalties check. Arlen insists that he gets something for himself. He asks a jeweller friend to make him a large silver ring engraved with an inward-turning spiral design. No specific reason, though the spiral had many associations for him. It just felt right. 2 years later, the first edition of the book you hold in your hands was published by Playboy Press. 50 years after Bob bought that spiral ring, I find myself called to write a new introduction to this book. In his own introduction to the 2000 AD edition, Wilson notes, "The man who wrote it does not exist anymore. Neither does the world he wrote of in 1973 or commented upon in 2000. Many aspects of those times, as seen by both that working-class New Yorker and this working-class Londoner, do seem to cohere, perhaps only in slightly mutated forms. Nowhere is this more apparent to me than in the areas of sex, drugs, and magic." I first read Wilson sometime around 1977, when I came upon a second-hand copy of Hilaritas in paperback. Because fate seems to be fickle, the bookshop only had books 2 and 3, but I got them anyway. It just felt right. Growing up weird in an impoverished part of a Kentish dock town, and having some incidences of high strangeness from the age of 7 onwards, I had a hunger for oddness, but especially for some way to bring context to a world whose local ideas of God and normal had nothing to offer. I had devoured Crowley alongside Colin Wilson, Jacques Vallée, and other explorers of the strange from my kindly local library in an attempt to make sense of at least some of my experiences. So seeing old Alistair's name on the back cover of the book was certainly a draw, but I was not prepared for the transformative effect it would have on me. Soon after, I read the first Cosmic Trigger, and it was the exact revelation that I needed. Wilson's ideas and speculations, and especially his hard-headed experimental records, gave me 2 vital ideas. That sorely needed context for the weirdness of the world and my mind. His multi-model approach and emphasis on internally directed neural change balanced with careful skepticism of your own ideas about truth. These are tools that have served me for nearly half a century. And permission to explore the possibilities of working with popular culture as my primary set of maps. Bob's use of Star Trek metaphors and drawing parallels between such fictional entities and the spirit world opened new vistas for me as a fledgling magician. Every new Wilson book I could find as I moved from my insular childhood to being a young adult working in London and joining in with the social world of both science fiction fandom and practical occultism gave me more points of reference, more maps to meld with my own, charting my journey and leaving markers to follow later. Another set of maps came from the Harlan Ellison short story collection, Deathbird Stories, in 1975. In the introduction, Ellison talks about the tales being modern mythologies for the new gods being born in our modern age. The grimoires and necronomicons of the gods of the freeway, of the ghetto blacks, of the coaxial cable, the pain god and the rock god and the god of neon, the god of legal tender, the god of business as usual, and the gods that live in the city streets and slot machines, the god of smog and the god of Freudian guilt, the machine god. They are a strange, unpredictable lot, these new, vital, muscular gods. How we will come to worship them, what boons they may bestow, their moods and their limitations, these are the subjects of these stories. I took hold of this idea of new gods, both from our times and especially our fictions, and ran with it in ways the staunchly atheist and straight-edge Ellison would not have approved of. And I was not alone in this. Around that time, a group of experimental mages in London and Leeds were drawing on similar currents to develop a postmodern, Wilson-influenced magical approach, which became known as chaos magic. I got my first copy of this book in 1987 when I was, of course, 23 years old. And unlike my earlier experiences with Wilson, my knowledge of both sex and drugs was no longer merely literary. I lost my first copy, probably lent it to a stoner friend. It's that sort of book. The second time it showed up for me was in the early 90s. Reading it with the second introduction was a significant development in my personal experiments with sex, drugs and magic in various combinations. Part 2. The Widening Gyre. I've just been spending time in the subway, riding in circles, thinking in circles. There's no way out. Detective Eddie Walensky, Dark City, 1998. I am not the youth I was in 1987, or the child I was in 1971, or the man of 1998, when Alex Proyas's film Dark City blew me away, putting aside even its immediate neighbour The Matrix a year later. Its imagery of spirals as the prime metaphor for its tightly controlled and manipulated world haunts me still. The Matrix was based in part on Morrison's The Invisibles, a comic book series rife with the spirit of Wilson and drawing on Morrison's own sex, drug, magic self-experiments, notably their exploration of gender in the autobiographical Lord Fanny. Morrison now identifies as non-binary. However, aspects of all these previous instances of Cat Vincent, or the different people I have been, cohere still, continually looping around in a spiral, never quite touching, but occupying the same angles of the circle of my life's experiences. So, to reread Sex and Drugs in 2021 with so much water and blood under the bridge was an eye-opener. I had, for one thing, forgotten just how much of the 1987 introduction had heavily influenced my magical praxis, especially around sex magic. The explicit alchemical symbolism Wilson spoke of there sent me to find the Louis T. Culling book mentioned as a useful manual. My first tattoo was of a white rose upon a red Templar cross, explicitly referencing it is only on the cross that the rose may bloom. But, reading with my 2021 eyes and contexts, a lot of the actual book bears, even demands, re-examination. For example, the very narrow, heteronormative, gender-essentialist sex magic formula given here looks very different to a bisexual, kinky man of this century. It's unquestionably a major piece of symbolism in the canon and one I use constantly, but it doesn't speak much to genderqueer people or to those not into penetrative sex. Though, of course, roses and thorns have a long-established legacy in the BDSM community. One of the changes in discussions of sexuality and gender these days is that the terminology has become far more complex, allowing for a wider range of perspectives and lived experiences, such as aromantic or asexual people, something the text treats as frigidity to be cured, and makes them much easier to discuss inclusively. Some find this difficult, but to a neophile like me, the more words we have, the more symbols and maps, the more we can talk about the true complexity of desire. Infinite diversity in infinite combination. The Vulcan philosophy of delight in difference, a concept that Bob loved. Even allowing for the shifts of meaning on this turn of the spiral, there's so much of value here, much of it timely in these upheaving times. For all the outdated slang, Bob's compassion for the subject of his stories is very present, as is his erudition and practicality, his even-handedness on balancing theory, history, and on-the-ground utility. One small part was an especial delight. For years, I'd heard a phrase from California's Silicon Valley acid heads and other hedonic engineers. No matter how hard you're tripping, remember that all cars continue to be real. As far as I can tell, the longer version you can find in this book is the oldest formulation of this idea in print. And it's damn good advice whenever you're trying to hack your own consciousness, using whichever combinations of sex, drugs, and magical technique you prefer. Wilson's modelling of magic as essentially a consciousness-hacking technology is always useful. Although the model's wielding as more of a cudgel than a scalpel has become sadly commonplace in online chaos magic groups, it's always going to have value, especially in those times when you're lost out there and need to ground. If it's not true, it's more than good enough to substitute as a field expedient. True enough for jazz. In my experience, just these tools and the litany against fear from Frank Herbert's Dune can get you a long way in such explorations. My magic has always, at the deepest levels, been an ongoing game of what if. What if the weird shit in my head can actually influence reality in however small a way? What happens if I live my life based on that assumption? What would it feel like to shift reality to favour your own patterns? Tuning, as they called it in Dark City. One thing that seems to be true as far as I can see is the importance of the patterns of and connections between symbol sets. The stories we tell ourselves, consume and enact are both part of our consciousness and, indirectly at least, a portion of our external reality. Spider Robinson, the science fiction writer who, like Wilson, was a Robert Heinlein fan and who will appear again later, said in his novel Mind Killer that any set of physical features can support beauty. Likewise, I think that any set of beliefs, of symbolic patterns, of internal maps, can support magic. And it was Bob who showed me how to both consider and test this. It's also good to reread how scathing Bob always was about the crippling influence of Christian morality on practitioners in this field. The situation on the ground in 2021 is very different in terms of which things are less taboo to discuss. Drug use generally, queerness, BDSM and kinky sex. Or the actual legality has changed. The legal cannabis industry, the fine work done towards the clinical use of entheogens in mental health by MAPS. Some things are a lot less scary to talk about and do. But any such progress or revelation is invariably against the aims and goals of those who are for the Jesus man. These times of Christian fascism with Trumpish characteristics have led to a backlash against many of these expressions and explorations, freedoms which I refuse to relinquish. We always need reminders that their morality is not ours and should not ever be allowed to interfere in safe, sane, and consensual experiments with neurology and desire. Just, you know, always have a safe word. Part 3. Turn, turn, turn. One measures a circle, beginning anywhere. Charles Fort. Low. I am in Liverpool, standing in Matthew Street alongside 50 Discordian-leaning writers, actors and aficionados, and a Scouts lad in an Everton FC number 23 shirt who somehow came along for the ride, performing a magical ritual under the bust of C.G. Jung on the site of both the Cavern Club and Ken Campbell's Science Fiction Theatre of Liverpool. The ritual is to draw on the powers of synchronicity in order to gain both attention and funding for the stage adaptation of Cosmic Trigger being developed by Ken's daughter, Daisy Ellis Campbell. She calls on Jung in the ritual to blow our minds, but not too much. I call on a fictional son of Liverpool, a creation of Alan Moore, who would go on to play both Lucifer and Fuck-Up in the play, the gutter wizard and conman John Constantine, to let us manifest his own synchronicity-riding powers, an act of magic I could not have conceived of were it not for the permission that I had taken from Wilson long before. The play manifests in Liverpool and then in a 1-month run in London. On the last day of that run, Daisy asked me to give the closing ritual for the run, just before the final performance. The audience includes Alan Moore, Jimmy Corty, formerly of the KLF and now involved with the building of a People's Pyramid in Liverpool, and documentarian Adam Curtis. It's a short working, barely 10 minutes long. In it, I suggest the idea that Discordians and other seekers of magic and wonder, the others that Leary exhorted us to find, are, in an idea taken from another science fiction influence, the Stardance books of Spider and Gene Robinson, the opposite of terrorists. People who plot openly to make the lives of others wonderful. This was the day after the Manchester Arena bombing. So terrorists, those with, as Wilson once said, a bomb but no air force, were on all our minds. I reminded the audience that the word conspiracy comes from a root meaning to breathe together, and called on us to simply breathe together, to try and call forth a world where the opposite of terrorists could grow, and pushed it into the universe with a united shout of NOD! The Robinsons called such people rapturists. My friend and colleague John Higgs, wanting to remove the Christian associations, renamed us wonderists, and we took as our creed an idea Higgs had explored earlier in the show's run and the poet Selina Godden had turned into a powerful statement. Pessimism is for lightweights. Turning Wilson's constant aid, the idea that optimism is a strategic survival choice, into a rallying cry, Selina wrote, Pessimism is for lightweights. There is no straight white line. It's the bumps and curves and obstacles that make this road yours and mine. Pessimism is for lightweights. This road is never easy or straight. And living is all about living alive and lively. And love will conquer hate. A couple of years after, Higgs would tell the story of the Matthew Street working in his introduction to the Hilaritas edition of the first Cosmic Trigger, folding me into the story of the book which changed my life. A week ago from writing this, Adam Curtis's latest documentary series, Can't Get You Out of My Head, aired on the BBC. In it, he tells the story of Kerry Thornley and how Discordianism and Operation Mindfuck inadvertently led to the world of today, a place of conspiracy and conspiracy run amok, of QAnon and Trumpism. Minds blown by far too much. While watching it, I saw a Facebook post from a QAnon enthusiast which spouted a popular conspiracy theory that adrenochrome is a potent drug harvested by the elites from the blood of the mentally ill. And the day before I had read this in this book, the specific fictional origin of that myth, Terry Southern's The Blood of a Whig. The synchronicity has not been sparse while writing this. Curtis had no easy solution for the state we're in, but watching it, I cannot help but think many of the specific tools and models we sorely need to both cope with and strive beyond this mess can be found in the pages of this book. These twists of the spiral of my life were unexpected. Writing this introduction 7 years to the day after the Matthew Street working is even more so. In too many ways, the world has not changed enough. All too familiar woes and wars still manifest, albeit in slightly different guises. But perhaps the tools Wilson helped develop and share with us will allow some of us to turn the spiral from a descent, an inward-dwelling rehash of old circuits, into an outward-reaching ascent, to let us stop constantly turning around in circles and find our way home. Thanks for listening. I hope you have an amazing night, and I'll see you all again soon.